Have you ever felt surprised or unprepared when things change in the world of social media? We felt the same way. We were tired of reacting to constant changes in marketing, algorithms, and consumer behavior, so we found a better way. Scan Club has been our secret weapon for over a year now, and we're excited to finally be sharing it with you. This approach has helped us future-proof our strategies and feel less reactive. It's not a crystal ball, and it doesn't allow us to predict everything, but it's helped us level up our work and collaborate more than ever before. So how does it work? Twice a month, you'll get a copy of Scan Club right to your inbox. It's our breakdown of the top signals we're watching and why they matter. You'll learn to spot these signals, understand their impact, and produce your content with confidence. Get the feature in your inbox, click the link in our description to subscribe today.
I think one of the biggest misses that a lot of publishers, one of the biggest kind of, what's the right word? I don't want to be so savage.
Go ahead, be savage.
Welcome back to Waves, powered by Arcade, a show for marketers, creators, and entrepreneurs who want to stop chasing the tide and start making waves online. We're your hosts, Mike and Mitzi, and today we're joined by Centennial World co-founders Lauren Meisner and Jordyn Christensen.
Lauren is the chronically online director of content at Centennial World. She has bylines and titles including Elle and Harper's Bazaar Australia. After noticing a gap in media for Gen Z publisher that specialized in internet culture, Lauren co-founded Centennial World in 2019. She writes the viral news Substack Infinite Scroll and co-hosts Centennial World's bi-weekly internet culture podcast at the same name, Infinite Scroll. We're big fans of that podcast. Jordyn is the director of brand and partnership at Centennial World. Previously a beauty editor, Jordyn has written for titles including Marie Claire, Elle, and Harper's Bazaar Australia. Jordyn co-founded Centennial World alongside Lauren, and she's also the co-host of Infinite Scroll podcast as well. Jordyn has managed partnerships with brands including Samsung, HP, Bumble, Pandora, MAC Cosmetics, and she's helped them reach and resonate with Centennial World's engaged Gen Z audience. Welcome to the show, Jordyn and Lauren. We're so excited to have you.
Thank you so much for having us. We're happy to chat.
Yeah, we're so excited.
Yeah, well, we're big fans of the podcast, and a few people on our team are big diehards of the podcast and the Substack. And we wanted to start our conversation today by doing something that you both do on your podcast, where you talk about what content you've been consuming this week. So maybe I'll hand it over to you both to start off telling us, what are you consuming this week? What are you excited about? And then maybe we'll do the same.
Yeah, so my brother just came over from Canada a couple months ago to live with my husband and I in Australia, do a year, like his working holiday visa. So I have indoctrinated him into the Bravo universe, and I am making him watch all of the Housewives with me, all the best series. I'm like, you have to watch Miami. We have to watch Beverly Hills. So right now we are on our Miami kick because Miami's about to come back in November and we have to be caught up.
Love that. You're doing the Lord's work there.
I am. I really am.
Well, she's also done that with me because I've now started my Real Housewives of New York City journey as that kind of new season and new cast is kicking off. And we also kind of look up to Jenna Lyons in more of a business capacity too. So it's really cool seeing her kind of personality come to light in the show. And then obviously Kardashian season 4. And I've backtracked a little bit to watch the D'Amelio show season 2 because I realized I hadn't watched that when the new season came out. And we also had Taylor Lorenz on our podcast recently, and her book Extremely Online, The Untold Story of Fame, Influence and Power on the Internet has just come out. So we've both ordered that and we're really excited to get into that when that arrives in Australia because she is amazing and kind of like the OG trailblazer when it comes to commentary on internet culture. So we love her.
Yeah,
sure.
I want to read that book for sure. I feel like when Threads dropped, Taylor Lorenz was like in the middle of it. She was like the queen of Threads when it had its moment.
Its brief moment.
I know. I'm still hoping that it comes back because I'm like, out of our team here at Arcade, I'm like the one that likes text-based social. Like I've always been on Twitter. I've always been on Reddit. I was excited for Threads. I just hoped it would be like, you know, like Twitter vibes, Twitter format with Instagram vibes. But it's kind of slipping now.
Yes.
Well, your content plate sounds amazing. Right now, this is so weird, but Mike and I were partners in life and business, and he's really into football, always has been. And this year, I'm getting so into it for some reason. And I know it's, partly the Taylor Swift effect of it all, but it's just really been so exciting for me to watch these games, which is so weird. I'm a football girly these days, but that's what I'm consuming. I'm also watching the new season of The Kardashians too. So that's always entertaining and interesting to watch.
I gotta say though, you started getting into football before Taylor Swift. I feel like you watched Hard Knocks with me. You got into the whole Jets narrative with Aaron Rodgers. And so I just got to give you credit for that. You came in before the Swifties did.
Thank you.
What team do you guys go for?
I just go for whoever has like most celebrity appeal at the moment. Like if there's a game on, I'm just like, oh, who are the famous like people who they're connected to? So it really depends. I feel like I can find something with every team.
But Mitzi was literally just sending me links today of Jets merch. So I feel like if you had to pick a team, you'd be cheering for the Jets.
Yes, the Jets right now. I don't know if you're familiar with HBO's Hard Knocks, but HBO does such a good job of like building a narrative. Feels like I watched a movie about this underdog team. And so I just really need to see it through for the full season. So I think they're my team for sure.
I'm more into fantasy football. So I cheer for a lot of different teams depending which players I draft each year. If I had to pick one, it would be the Colts because I grew up in Indianapolis, but it sucks to cheer for them. So right now, the 49ers are really fun to watch with Christian McCaffrey. But other than that, content I've been consuming, like I said, I spend a lot of time on Reddit. I really enjoy that as a space. A lot of it is football-related content. Mitzi and I are watching The Morning Show right now on Apple TV Plus. That's been a treat for us for sure. I don't know. That's about it.
Well, we're so excited to get into it. There's so much that we want to unpack about your podcast, your media brand, and everything else related to that. But I'm always so curious to hear about how people find their business partners. And like we mentioned, we're business partners and life partners. So I'm wondering if you can unpack how you two met and how you started Centennial World.
Yeah, so Jordyn and I met as beauty writers by trade here in Australia. So as you mentioned in our bios, we were both writing for different digital publications, including Elle Australia, Harper's Bazaar Australia. Jordyn worked for Marie Claire. So it was kind of just like an industry connection. We used to work together. And Jordyn moved to New York temporarily in 2019 and was freelancing and doing like the glam New York City media girly vibe. And I was still slogging it out in Sydney. And at the time, I would pitch stories to different editors about, like Jeffree Star's palette launch or, I don't know, the latest James Charles drama, whoever was like the biggest beauty person online at the time. Obviously, as a beauty writer, I'm like, we have to be writing about this palette launch, like this has outsold every single palette launch to ever exist. And being told at that time, that's not mainstream enough. We don't cover those kinds of people, those types of launches. And I have always been very deep in internet culture. I've loved drama channels since they existed. So I saw all of the views, for example, that drama channels were getting at that time. And I was like, there's just such a missed opportunity for a publisher to be covering this content and covering these people in a meaningful way, like legitimate media. So I was getting really frustrated. And actually, the straw that broke the camel's back for me was Jaclyn Hill's Lipstick Gate, when that was literally being picked up by like the BBC at that point. Like that was really the first story, like the internet culture story. I feel that really like transcended into mainstream media, and still being told we don't cover that, we can't write about it. And I remember I was listening to a pop culture podcast try and cover that scandal. And I loved that podcast. I listened to it every week, and they knew so little compared to how much I felt like I knew. And I was like, no, something has to give here. I have to get involved in this somehow. And there was a lot of changes at my work at the time anyways. So I messaged Jordyn and I was like, how would you feel about maybe like doing something with me? And obviously we were both beauty writers. So I really did think at the time it was going to be more like beauty focused and beauty YouTuber focused, beauty influencer focused. Those were the biggest celebrities online at the time. And she was like, yes, for sure. Like I knew she was freelancing, so she might have a little extra time to go in on something with me, which was kind of my thought process. And we obviously were like friends and had a good relationship and stuff. And she said yes. And then like maybe 2 months after I sent her that first message, we had like a few talks about it here and there, but nothing super serious. And then she called me like 2 months later and she was like, I've actually moved back to Sydney. Do you want to do this thing or should I go get a job? And I was like, oh, okay. So I gave my notice and we launched 6 weeks later.
That's so fun.
That's so awesome.
So did it start as a podcast? Like, did it start as a blog? And then I guess my follow-up question to that is, you can't podcast with everyone. I feel like it takes a really unique person that you can, one, have a conversation with, but secondly, you can both kind of like build on each other's conversations in front of the camera. Like, how did you know that you had that rapport with each other?
We had no idea.
No, and to be honest, we probably had no rapport. That is something that we've built up over 4 years of like throwing a bunch of shit at the wall and seeing what sticks. Like we are truly, it feels like we're truly running everything in such a scrappy way, but that's also kind of what's fun about running a startup and having a small team is that we kind of get to have our fingers in a bunch of different pies. We're learning so much. We're constantly being challenged. So I think the podcast was definitely one of the bigger challenges because obviously you're kind of building a public profile at the same time. And that was never necessarily our intention. We always wanted the brand to be able to stand alone, not be piggybacking off us. And to be fair, at the time, we weren't really anyone with any kind of following or recognition, but it definitely was a balancing act of figuring out how to grow the brand and then kind of having this part where we were sharing our personal opinions and we were being held personally accountable by what we were saying and building our kind of personal brands off the back of that. So it was a really interesting time.
But no, we didn't start as a podcast. So we launched as a digital publication and we launched as Centennial Beauty because at the time, like I said, we thought we'd be covering the beauty industry more and like beauty YouTubers and stuff. But just over the last 3.5 years, the internet has changed so much. I mean, TikTok barely even existed when we launched, and that just completely changed the game for the direction of our content. So we launched Centennial Beauty, but it's now Centennial World. We've since rebranded in December 2019. And then we started our podcast in February 2020. So just a few months later, and we knew we needed to have a podcast to be competitive in the media industry here, especially because at the time, so few publishers actually had a podcast and honestly still kind of don't have podcasts. So it was important to us that we had that facet of the business that was like a standalone. But yes, that's kind of how the evolution of our brand happened.
Yeah, and for us too, we thought it was really important once we actually started, being in the weeds of the business and having those conversations, that there's a lot of nuance when it comes to internet culture and you can't necessarily do justice to the back and forth and the weeds of stories in a commentary piece or an opinion piece or a news article. So having a platform where we can actually have that discourse, I think was also really important because there's just so many bits and pieces that are necessary to include when discussing internet culture and creators. And there's just so much going on that having kind of a long form platform like a podcast felt like the best way to do the category justice.
That makes a lot of sense. I was chatting with Mel, who works with us here, and she mentioned the growth of the brand. And I feel like she's been kind of riding with you from those early days. And you mentioned that it took a few years to kind of build some of these pieces up, like your blog and your podcast and your newsletter. How do you stay the course? Like what kind of like kept you going because building a brand is a lot of work, but building an audience is so much harder than that. Like everyone can make something look good, but building an audience of people who ride with you, who are subscribed to you. And then I know you also have a closed group on Geneva, which I think we're going to get into as well. Like how did you stay the course and stay consistent through all of those evolutions of the brand?
We're still trying to stay the course, to be honest. It's so hard, like it really is. And obviously we're building a company, but we're also building an audience and our product is our audience, right? So it's like this kind of two-pronged thing. I think the biggest challenge, it was like the biggest challenge, but also the biggest blessing, to be honest, was lockdown. Because when we went into lockdown so soon after we launched, I mean, obviously budgets all dried up and it was just such a really difficult couple of years, but because we launched when we did, we had almost no overheads. Like we didn't have to pare back in any capacity. So like having no budget for 2 years, or practically no budget for 2 years, like that wasn't actually a blow to us because we didn't know what real life was. Like we didn't actually know what normal budgets looked like and things like that. So that's been really, I think from a commercial perspective, that's how we've stayed the course, is that we started in the worst time ever. So anything is better than that. And then I guess from an audience perspective, like around this time last year, so around November of last year, we split our roles. So prior to now, Jordyn and I were both doing everything. So we were both doing commercial, like we didn't have set kind of roles for ourselves. We were both doing content, we were doing everything. And we just got to the point where we felt like it was not productive anymore. So we decided to split our roles. And obviously now I own content and Jordyn owns commercial marketing growth from that side of the business. And that's been amazing for us in terms of being able to actually focus on the growth of both of those factors, right? Because our audience needs to grow for us to have our company grow. So that's what my focus is now, is audience growth. And from the podcast perspective, you know, our podcast was very slowly growing, like literally so incrementally for the first like 2-3 seasons. And then when we split our roles in November, that's actually when we saw growth, because I actually could take that and say, okay, like this is my, like I own this now, this is my role now. So a few major things we did was we started recording video for all of our podcasts. And so much of my time now is just making little podcast TikToks. And that's been huge for our growth. Putting all of our podcast on YouTube has been huge for us. Getting some big guests like Taylor Lorenz, who really like legitimizes what we're trying to do and our message in the industry itself, was a big part of it. And asking, honestly, our listeners to leave us reviews. So we used to ask, obviously, in every episode, like, please review us. But now we ask them and then we read the reviews that we got the week before. And that's encouraged people every single week to review us. So that has really snowballed that growth on that side. And then from, you know, our publication and our social perspective, we have always had a really big US-based audience. So for us, kind of making sure, like while we have the audience there, like online, for example, it's like getting that legitimacy there and people knowing who we are in the industry was really important for my goals this year. So we've started hiring or contracting US freelancers, like internet culture journalists that can write freelance pieces for us. And then they're posting those articles that they're writing for us on Twitter and stuff. So we're making a bit of a name for ourselves in like the US internet culture space. And that's been really important to our site growth as well.
And that was a big part too of deciding what our content direction was going to be, because obviously people have started to cotton on to the idea that influencers, TikTok creators have very engaged audiences. And when you write a news piece about a TikTok creator, people will go and consume that content. So for us, we started noticing publications, you know, like Elle or like traditionally fashion lifestyle publications start to cover the kind of creators that we were desperate to cover when we were working there, because that's just how it's evolved. And so for us, it's been a massive focus to just own our niche, to not kind of veer into the celebrity news quite so much, even if they are Gen Z celebrities, just really focus on that internet culture, stay in our lane, do that really, really well and become the experts in a single category. Because it's really easy to be like, oh, let's write about Zendaya and Tom Holland. And then you look out and every single lifestyle entertainment publication in the world is written about them. Whereas we're the only ones that, you know, can necessarily write about David Dobrik's Fall from Grace with the gravity and the context that it deserves. So I think really acknowledging where we fit in the media landscape too has been really crucial for us.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I feel like a lot of the publications, the more traditional publications that you referenced, they're likely, at least from my perspective, still really focused on the millennial audience. They probably think they're trying to reach Gen Z, but doing a poor job of it. Where you both say that Centennial World is a Gen Z media brand. So can you talk to us a little bit about that a little bit more, and even what, from your experience so far, you feel Gen Z is looking for from a media brand like yours?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, I think a massive part of speaking to Gen Z is bringing the context and understanding to the stories that we're reporting on. So, like I mentioned before, like David Dobrik and the Vlog Squad, like you need to have an understanding of how he grew his audience and the platform in the first place and the role of parasocial relationships and the nuances of how brand partnerships are involved. And, as those brand partnerships for him started dropping off as he got wrapped up in drama and his cancellation. So I feel like that's an advantage we have, is that we really have followed these creators from the beginning. So that makes a massive difference when you're reporting on it, because you're speaking to your audience on the same level of understanding as them. And then the format that we deliver content is really important too. Like we know that Gen Z don't want to leave the platform they're on to get the information they need. So we have really significantly different strategies for, TikTok content, for our podcast, for our site. Like we are building a circular audience, but we also acknowledge that TikTok needs to be its own focus, its own strategy, growing an audience on that platform. It needs to be content that is created specifically for that platform. So I think understanding the platforms and understanding the content, and those kind of go hand in hand. And I don't think many other, tooting our own horn a little bit here, I don't think many other media brands have been able to replicate that combination of things the way that we've been able to kind of grow and develop over the last couple of years.
And in terms of what Gen Z is looking for, I think one of the biggest misses that a lot of publishers, I guess, like one of the biggest kind of, what's the right word? I don't want to be so savage.
Go ahead, be savage.
One of the ways that bigger publishers, more traditional publishers, are missing out on reaching Gen Z, like you said, I really do think they think they're targeting youth, but they actually are targeting like that millennial audience, even like Gen X audience. I think it's the relevance. Like just because something is happening on TikTok doesn't mean that it's a trend. It doesn't mean that just because one video went viral of one person doing something doesn't mean that that thing is now a TikTok trend. And just because one person, a regular person, goes viral doesn't mean that they deserve a news article written about them. Like, the headline, like TikTok woman does X. Gen Z doesn't care about that. They saw that video. That person has 600 followers. They don't need a news article written about them. So I think a lot of the stuff that's happening in digital media right now is being reported on by, like people that don't understand the space as well. And they think that just because something happens on TikTok, that's quote unquote Gen Z. But that's not relevant to Gen Z and they don't care.
Well, it's also an ethical conversation because this person doesn't necessarily expect, they just did one thing that they thought was funny and they probably thought they were posting to their friends. Now it's gone viral and they have a bunch of news articles written about them. Like that is also a really interesting component of TikTok, is that it makes things that in theory you could just be creating for fun, and now all of a sudden like Us Weekly is picking you up for something that you never expected them to. And that's kind of like spirals out of control as well.
There's a narrative.
Yeah. And then if someone's written about you and uses your name and you Google yourself like 6 months later, that just kind of follows you around, which is the nature of the internet, which is so interesting. I feel like everyone, and like, correct me if I'm wrong, but does it irk you when you see these traditional media companies, ones that you formerly maybe worked for, start to cover or get into your lane that you've been carving out because there was a need? Like I personally have seen some of these publications start covering these kind of things. And I think we're slowly starting to like legitimize creators. Like Forbes has their creator list out. I think it's the second year ever that they've done it. But we're starting to see like so much value that some of these internet people or creators are bringing to, business in the world and all of that. Like what do you see in terms of like future casting? Like what do you think about when it comes to like this media brand that you're creating for Gen Z around internet culture, which is becoming more important for most traditional media brands? Like where do you hope that this will evolve?
Yes, it is definitely frustrating to see that. I think TikTok, honestly, the explosion of TikTok in lockdown completely changed the media landscape, because we'd never seen anything explode quite like that in terms of a social media platform, obviously. And the personalities that came out of that became so famous overnight. And everybody just all of a sudden was like, oh my God, we need to be talking about Charli D'Amelio, or we're not actually, covering relevant content. So now, like I said before, it's kind of a lot of these journalists who previously, maybe they were entertainment reporters, but they're being asked to cover these internet personalities now, whereas before they were covering like A-list celebrities. And it's just a different ballgame, and you need to understand the industry really in depth to cover it with the proper like context and nuance and gravity that it deserves. In terms of where I guess we fit now, it's interesting because we launched at, I think, a good time in the sense that everything, like internet culture started to become more important probably about 6 months to a year after we launched. So we were already kind of doing that. But I feel like if we had launched maybe like 2 years before, we would have been like really on the pulse. But in terms of, I guess, where we hope to go from here, we just kind of listen to what our podcast audience and our Geneva, community is telling us. And I guess the biggest feedback that we're getting from them is even if other podcasts are covering creators now in internet culture, or even if other bigger media brands are doing the same, people constantly tell us that like no one else is doing the research or understands the background that we do. And I think that comes from like a combination of our superpowers, like Jordyn being a traditionally trained journalist and me being addicted to the internet and social media. I think we have this like perfect combination of how we kind of attack these topics and understand these topics. So that's just what we're like sticking by. We're not going to change anything too much, We're just trying to like stay the course and really just continue to push that understanding that we are like the experts. We've been doing this. We know what we're doing, and hopefully that will just pay off.
I'm excited to chat through your Geneva community. So we're seeing, like as marketers, like a huge trend towards more closed communities and brands trying to create these like closed communities for a few reasons. One of them is that algorithms just aren't the same as they used to be. And so it's just so important to like really create this close connection between your audience and your community. So talk to us about your Geneva community. How did that get started and what inspired you to do that?
Yeah, so we actually recorded a podcast episode maybe a year ago now, because I think it's when you were home in Canada, like before the last trip. It was a remote recording. But there was a lot of conversation at the time about how Gen Z are actually desperate for privacy online, which is such stark contrast to millennials being so aspirational and, it's all about presentation and growing a following. So I think that really, we kind of been feeling that, but I think The Atlantic wrote a really interesting piece on it that we kind of pulled from. And we realized a few major things about Gen Z. Like they've grown up in the throes of cancel culture, the spread of misinformation, and virtually no privacy online. So we've really seen a shift away from Gen Z wanting to be so performative on public-facing social media platforms. And then like you mentioned too, the algorithms, like TikTok's intuitive algorithm, we've kind of always seen that a little bit with YouTube, but how intuitive TikTok's algorithm has really allowed people to kind of hone in on their niche interests and find people that, like the same content, consume the same content, find like-minded people that they can have discourse and conversations with. So I think that has been a really natural transition from kind of finding those niche interests and focus groups into spaces like Discord and Geneva, where you can then discuss that kind of more openly. So we were in New York last year and we actually ended up, I'm not even sure how we ended up meeting with Kim, but she was one of the really early hires at Geneva. She actually had come from Glossier, and we had a meeting with her and we said, this looks really cool, just kind of meeting early stage founders or like-minded people while we were over there for a few weeks. And she was explaining the push that they were doing for Geneva and the purpose that it served, and how they really saw that as this new space for Gen Z to really communicate and connect with like-minded people, especially because Geneva at its core is kind of focused on connecting people in real life kind of cities and locations. So it started out as, like a Dallas book club, and then they can start on that group and then they can meet up in real life. So I think that kind of focus for Geneva sounded really, really interesting to us. And then we've also noticed Gen Z have had their formative years in the pandemic. They've been isolated. So whether they're kind of making up for that through online connection and these groups of people that share common interests, and then they can transition that potentially into real life connections, I think Geneva just kind of felt like the right fit for us for Gen Z conversations and to kind of help build our community and our audiences.
That makes a lot of sense, especially when you talk about it as like person to person. I'd love to hear from the two of you about how you approached starting a community like that from a brand perspective. Because I feel like, especially with Gen Z, often there's more hesitation around like that kind of conversation with a brand. What did that look like for you? What was the strategy?
So, yes, I mean, launching our Geneva Group was a big part of trying to make our audience more circular, because I know Jordyn mentioned this earlier, but we had our digital publication, our podcast, our TikTok. Those were kind of our three main platforms at the time for the first like 2.5, 3 years of our business. And our audiences, for the most part, were completely different on every single platform. And when we were in New York last year, we met with a big publisher, and they were so amazing and helpful to us. And they gave us like a strategy session. It was like honestly amazing. We met with like a bunch of editors in chief, and it was great. And they all told us like you need to have more of a circular audience. You need to build this community aspect. Your podcast is a great way to kind of segue into that. So that's how we approached it. Was obviously our podcast has always been our most engaged audience, and they come to the podcast for us as opposed to for like the news stories as much, if that makes sense. So we started promoting our Geneva Group on our podcast, just telling people this is where you can chat about with other listeners, the different topics that we talk about. You can give us feedback, all of that. And so, yeah, we decided, of course, our group is going to be called Infinite Scroll, and it's not about our podcast though. And I think that's kind of the biggest takeaway or biggest thing that we wanted to push is like, when you're a brand, you don't want to start a community group like that and be like selling them your brand. Nobody's going to join that. So the point is not for us to be posting in it about our podcast and about our business or like linking our articles or anything like that. Like, we're not trying to drive traffic to anything. We're not trying to sell our audience anything in that group. We don't do sponsorships in that group, anything like that. It's strictly for our listeners or anybody who loves Centennial World as an overarching brand to jump in and to just talk about the topics that we talk about. So I would say that's probably like the biggest takeaway for us, or like for anybody listening, is if you do have a business, you want to start this community, you kind of have to approach it the same way that people talk about approaching content creation. Like, you're not just going to, if you're a company, you're not just going to post product shots on your Instagram. You need to post things that are really educational or relevant and that people are going to want to engage with. You can't just be constantly selling to your audience.
One quick follow-up question I had was you both mentioned a circular audience a couple times. And for some people, I think that might be a no-brainer, but I feel like there's going to be some listeners that may not understand what we're talking about. So could you just clarify a little bit more what you mean by a circular audience?
Yeah, for a circular audience, we really just want our site visitors to also be our podcast listeners, to also subscribe to our newsletter, to also be in our Geneva group. We just want lots of touch points with the same people, as opposed to having different groups engaging on every different platform that our brand exists. I think that's far better for community and engagement. And to the point about Geneva before too, like, we don't push any sponsorships or really allow any kind of commercial content to go live in the Geneva group, but it is also a really good selling point from a commercial perspective, because I will just mention that in pitch meetings to clients as evidence of how engaged our audience is. So even though brands aren't allowed to touch that group, it does really support the mentality that, we are cultivating something. We have people that trust us, and vice versa. We love receiving feedback that informs a lot of what we do, but they kind of go hand in hand. So it is still really useful from a commercial perspective to have that community as well.
Yeah, as a marketer, it's super impressive to hear that like you have people who listen to your podcast, who read your blogs, and also go that extra step to engage with the community of like-minded people. Like, that is so hard to achieve as a brand. So I think it's really just speaks to how you've like created this community of people and attracted the right people to each other. So I think that's really cool. I want to kind of put on my marketing hat again and talk about just internet drama and its impact on greater consumer behavior. So there's so many stories that have happened this year. We don't have to get super specific, but we've seen that like internet drama can drive consumer behavior. And I'm curious, like, what are your thoughts around that? And we've kind of touched on this too, on like the importance of internet culture and how it's going to start being like documented more in mainstream media because it's a driver. So I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I feel like it's definitely influencing consumer behavior, especially from a Gen Z perspective. I don't think it's groundbreaking to say that Gen Z is absolutely bombarded with digital advertising constantly and that they just don't have the same trust in advertising and also influencer marketing that previous generations had, especially millennials. We loved an influencer marketing moment, and it doesn't work as well on Gen Z. So I think it absolutely is impacting, I think, internet culture and like the drama that's happening online between influencers or just with TikTok trends, whatever it is definitely impacting how they consume, because, now it's like influencer brands, celebrity brands are a dime a dozen. Like they're constantly launching. It's not this same it doesn't have the same, I guess, gravity that it used to have, or like a YouTube sponsorship between, like Morphe and James Charles. Like that's not going to necessarily sell the same way that it used to for this younger generation. So I absolutely think that what is happening online between these personalities is for sure influencing Gen Z consumer behavior. But I also just think in general, because Gen Z is so overexposed when it comes to, digital advertising is so in their face all the time. They do tend to want to buy more like locally or from grassroots brands, like brands that have more of like a message or that they can feel connected to, that they feel like they're making a difference with. But what is interesting about that is while they might say that they want that and that is a value to them, a lot of the research still shows that they are like the biggest group buying fast fashion, for example, right? Because they still, at the end of the day, don't want to be the ones that don't have the same trends as all of their friends. So it's interesting because it's like this dichotomy right now, but I do think as Gen Z gets older and they start making more money and they leave home and they're kind of in a different financial position, I think we might start to see like their consumption of fast fashion or like cheaper brands, cheaper products kind of go by the wayside, and they might start spending their dollars in the way that they claim their values go.
Yeah, I think the shift has been really interesting because it has forced brands to, if an influencer or creator is getting canceled for X, Y, or Z, it does force brands to reflect internally a little bit about what they're putting out in the world. So I think that has had a positive knock-on effect at the end of the day. But I also think, trips like the Tarte Dubai influencer trip, that was obviously dramatic for no other reason than everyone was just shocked that brands have that much money to spend on influencers or, on their marketing. It's just very overt way of marketing that we're not kind of used to seeing flounced around like that coming out the other side of COVID. But I still think that brand awareness piece is so important, and there will always be a place for, influencers, creators, the drama of it all within bounds that resonates with Gen Z, that gets them talking about things, encourages discourse. I think that still truly at the end of the day does sell products. It just looks a bit different to how we are used to creators and influencers functioning as kind of marketing vessels.
For sure. And I also think that the skeptical in me wonders if some of these dramas that have happened are produced, or if people are starting to wonder how to produce them that make in a way that feels organic, because you're right, it does get people talking about it. It kind of floods your For You page. You just can't kind of like look away. I remember the controversy with Michaela around the L'Oreal like mascara, and so many people started buying that mascara and trying it out. So, although I'm sure that wasn't produced, I think that was really like difficult for Michaela. If you were looking at it from another perspective, it's like, why not try to repeat something like that with someone else?
Yeah, well, the Jones Road Beauty Foundation, I'm not sure if you guys remember this, which is Bobbi Brown's new company, and they sent it to Meredith, yeah, who is notorious for using like a ridiculous amount of foundation, and she gave it a horrific review. And it ended up being so positive for the brand because everyone came forward, A, buying it to try it themselves, and B, to provide their own commentary that it was only bad because she didn't use the product right and she actually didn't understand the purpose of that product and where it fits in, you know, a beauty routine. So that was another really interesting example of where it seems like drama, but honestly, like they easily could have sent that to her for that purpose to kind of start stirring up that conversation.
Yeah. And I think brands are starting to see and be more, and maybe it's just younger, you know, more digital savvy people are working behind these brands, but they're starting to see opportunities like that rather than just trying to play it safe. Like, what can we do to drum up some noise? So I think it's super interesting, and the things that you're covering in your podcast and in your content too, like how it kind of leads to like bigger decisions. And I think some of this might be repeatable. So it's something that I'm definitely like keeping in mind.
Speaking of big moments on the internet, one question we always love to ask is, who's making waves right now and why?
Okay, so after having a little think about this, we actually have an Aussie friend, Michelle Battersby, who has just raised a ton of money, but they have designed and created an app called Sunroom that is essentially a kind of new age version of like OnlyFans cross Patreon, but it's a way for creators to make money. So they have anti-screenshot tech that they developed, and it's a way for creators to be creating content in kind of a safe space with audiences that are paying for their content but really resonate and trust them. So it's a really, really interesting app, Sunroom. I would definitely recommend everyone check it out. It's really kind of at the forefront of the sex positive / tech spaces crossing over.
Yeah, that definitely sounds awesome. Need a challenger brand in that space too.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Lauren and Jordyn, we're at the end of this thing. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise. It's been cool, like Mitzi said, to just follow along through your journey. And we also just draw inspiration from the two of you and what you're building, because obviously we have a podcast of our own and have a few different media channels of our own as well. So I think this has been a great conversation, and we'll keep it going for sure.
Thank you guys so much. This was so fun. We hope we were articulate enough.
Absolutely. 100%. Thank you.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to Waves. If you enjoyed this episode, you can hit subscribe, give us a thumbs up, or drop a comment. And don't forget to follow along on social at Hello Arcade. See you next time.